Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back here for our next lecture in AP US History. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering topic 3.10, Shaping a New Republic, Part 1. This is all about the presidency of George Washington, and since there's so much here, this is going to be a two-parter for these videos. So that leads us into our learning objective. We have two learning objectives for this. First one says explain how and why competition intensified conflicts among peoples and nations between 1754 and 1800, which is fairly general. And then more specifically, objective 3L says explain how and why political ideas, institutions, and party systems developed and changed in the new republic. So that leads us then to key idea number one. So key idea number one says, during the presidential administration of George Washington and John Adams, political leaders created institutions and precedents that put the principles of the Constitution into practice. So what we really want to focus on here is how do these first two presidents create institutions, parts of our government, and how they set up precedents that's like traditions for future presidents to follow. So let's just kind of get into the timeline, the history of everything. So 1789, the Constitution's ratified after that big ratification debate. We get all the states to unanimously approve it, especially after the approval of the Bill of Rights. And George Washington is unanimously elected our first president. You can see the electoral vote on the bottom left-hand side, and nobody runs against him. He just stands for president, is what they said, and so he becomes our very first president of the United States. He was the obvious choice, really, with everybody. And as president of the United States, he's going to really do a lot to shape the new nation, and he's going to create a series of precedents for future presidents and leaders. And it really kind of, in many ways, is summed up by this really kind of famous poem about George Washington, where it said, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. And he's going to be the first to do many, many, many things. And pretty much every president since George Washington has followed a lot of those precedents and traditions that he set. I mean, just for example, all right, you would have during his inauguration, he brought with him his family Bible and placed his hand upon it. And at the end of the oath of office, which is an official, it's in the Constitution oath, he adds, so help me God, which wasn't part of the oath. Ever since then, every other president, all the way to the one we have right now, has brought a family Bible or two to the inauguration, put their hand upon it, and at the end said, so help me God. So even the little things, he has set precedents on for future presidents. So during his first term, Washington's going to focus mostly on domestic issues. We're going to see foreign policy have a much bigger influence on his second term. And these domestic issues are going to really shape this new nation. And there's going to be a couple things that he's going to do right off the bat. One of his first major actions where he helps to create an institution in our government is by the passage of the Judiciary Act in 1789. Now, what this does is it creates all of the other lower federal courts. Now, the Constitution in Article 3 had created the United States federal court system. And this was a major improvement over the Articles of Confederation, which had no nationalized court system. But the only portion that was in the Constitution was the actual Supreme Court. There was nothing else below it. And the Supreme Court certainly couldn't hear every single federal case that came before it. And so the Judiciary Act is going to create all of those lower federal courts and set up the framework for adding more in the future, which really becomes important for helping to solidify the power of our third branch of government, the judicial branch. Another major accomplishment that Washington does as part of his setting up institutions is the creation of a cabinet. Every president since Washington has had a cabinet. Some are more influential than others, but it is a list of official advisors who head the major executive departments. Now, some presidents have had an informal set of advisors that they listen to more than their official set of the cabinet. But the cabinet was an institution of formal advisors to the president that was set up by Washington very early on. And it included a who's who's list from the Revolution. It included George Washington as the president, Henry Knox, who was the Secretary of War, Alexander Hamilton, who headed up the Secretary of the Treasury, Edmund Randolph, who was the Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General is the person who helps to enforce the nation's laws. They prosecute people that have broken national laws. And Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, he was in charge of all foreign relations. Now, there are going to be disagreements between some of these men, and some of these disagreements are considerable, and they're important differences within Washington's cabinet. Probably one of the more important people in Washington's cabinet was Alexander Hamilton. Now, of course, we probably know a lot more about him these days thanks to the musical. But what he believed in is he believed in a strong national government, and he believed it was necessary to provide order in America. In addition, he also was very focused on the economy, and he wanted, with the economy, to focus on industry. As a person that was raised in New York, he was born in the Caribbean, he really saw New York and city life and urban centers as the future economic engine that would drive the United States. In addition to this, he also saw the Constitution as a loose framework, an idea that was something that could be interpreted. And so he believed in a loose interpretation that would allow the government to do more and respond to issues. Now, conversely, across the table from him was Thomas Jefferson, who believed much differently than Alexander Hamilton, and these two guys would intellectually spar often. Jefferson, on the other hand, he's going to believe that political power should remain with state governments, not with the national government like Hamilton believed. And it needed to be that way, thought Jefferson, was to be able to promote liberty and protect the people. He also wanted the economy to maintain more focus on farming, and he saw an agrarian or a future of farmers in the United States. He also interpreted the Constitution differently. He very much believed that the Constitution should be strictly interpreted, which means that if it doesn't say it in the Constitution, that the government shouldn't be allowed to do it, and that all other powers should be reserved to the state governments. This would limit the power of the national government and strengthen the power of the state governments. Probably one of the biggest things that these guys disagreed over, though, was over Hamilton's financial plan. So let's kind of dive into what this thing was. So right after the creation of the Constitution, the U.S. government was still in dire financial straits. Things were not economically very good, and some of those bad economic conditions had been the direct cause of Shays' rebellion that had led to the creation of the new Constitution. And a lot of it had to deal with state debts. So in 1789, right as we're getting going, Hamilton's going to propose a new financial plan that would guide the future for the U.S. economy. So he had a few parts in his plan. The first part of this was the funding and assumption of all state debts incurred during the Revolutionary War. Now, here's what that would mean. That would mean that the federal government would take on or assume any individual debts that each state owed, which meant that it would force the U.S. government and the states to work together. Now, this would also create a national debt. And we've got a national debt today, and it's controversial today, and it was controversial back then. But what Hamilton said was that by creating this national debt and then being able to pay on it, the United States would gain credit. Right? Just like you have a credit score, the United States would gain good credit and therefore be able to more easily borrow money in the future. Now, Congress and Washington will approve of this plan for funding and for assumption. However, this relied on the collection of money. You can't pay debt unless you had income. And this leads us into the second part of Hamilton's financial plan, his ability to raise money for the new nation. Now, to do this, he wanted to propose a tax on whiskey, and he would also create a protective tariff. A tariff is a tax on foreign products that would promote American industry by making foreign products more expensive. Now, to this, Congress is going to approve the whiskey tax. However, it doesn't approve the protective tariff. And that leads us then into point number 3 of Hamilton's plan. The third point of Hamilton's plan was the creation of the Bank of the United States, usually abbreviated BUS. And what they would do is they would regulate the money supply, and they would also hold all federal funds and loan it to state banks, thus giving the federal government a way to earn even more income from the interest on the money that it had lent out. So that money goes out, and then they can collect that back in with interest payments. The problem was for Jefferson is that the Bank of the United States he thought was unconstitutional. It gave too much power to the bankers in cities Plus, on top of that, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the government can create a national bank. Hamilton says, though, it was necessary and proper, words out of the last of the enumerated powers in Article 1 of the Constitution, the ability of Congress to control the economy and regulate currency. Now, Washington's going to agree with Hamilton and Congress, and they create the Bank of the United States in 1791. However, this whiskey tax isn't exactly popular with everybody, and in 1794, the whiskey tax will lead directly to an incident called the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, the whiskey tax mostly hurt Western farmers, especially in Pennsylvania. They saw it as an unfair tax on the poor, and many people, you may remember about Shays' Rebellion, broke out in 1787 because of that weak government and couldn't stop it. However, when the Whiskey Rebellion begins in 1794, Washington saw this as a threat to public safety. He's going to mobilize a 13,000-man army, march to the foot of the Appalachians, and this quickly ends the rebellion. Now, unlike Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion is going to reveal the strength of the new government under the Constitution. This leads us to our last key idea for today, key idea number 2. Which says political leaders in the 1790s took a variety of positions on issues such as the relationship between the national government and states, economic policy, foreign policy, and the balance between liberty and order. This led to the formation of political parties. Now, we've already kind of discussed this a little bit in previous slides, but we'll just hit this up again really quickly so we can make sure that we're straight on this very important point as we go forward. So as we've already said, the disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson are going to lead to the formation of America's first political parties. And understanding these political parties will help us contextualize further political parties as we go forward. A key skill that you'll need to know as you go forward in this AP class is knowing the development of different political parties. So Hamilton's going to form that very first political party called the Federalist Party. And there's a couple ideas that go along with that. First of all, we have the idea of a strong national government, a loose interpretation of the Constitution, a strong financial system that favored banks and industry, and in terms of foreign relations and foreign policy, something we haven't talked about too much quite yet, is they're going to support England, especially when war is going to break out between England and France in the 1790s. Now, much of that is because of the belief in the banking and the industry. England is still our biggest trade partner, and so Hamilton sees that support of England as being kind of congruent with his support of the financial industry and the developing industries of the United States. On the other side, we've got Thomas Jefferson. He's going to form the other political party, and that's going to be the Democratic Republicans. Now, conversely to the Federalists, the Republicans are going to support strong state governments, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He was more in favor of state banks and policies that supported small farmers rather than a national bank and things that supported industry. And when war breaks out, he's going to support and want to support France when war breaks out between France and England. Well, we're going to go ahead and end our lecture for our first part today over the early part of Washington. We'll pick up part 2 with Washington's presidency next time. Until then, go Pack.